As we ended our lecture last time, we saw, or I mentioned, how the oldest and still most important source for the history of Ukraine and for the East Slavs as a whole are the so-called chronicles of events that were composed by writers specifically in Kyiv and other cities of what we're going to see is the Rus Confederation. And those chronicles began to be put down already beginning in the second half of the 11th century. That is the second half of the 1000s. One of the oldest and most important of them, it's probably the first written chronicle throughout the Slavic world, is called the Primary Chronicle. Or we can say the Rus Primary Chronicle, sometimes called the Chronicle of Nestor, a monk who was one of those who began this chronicle, but certainly subsequent additions were made to it. Also known by its first line, the Povest Vremennych Let, or the tale of bygone years. Because that first line in the chronicle reads, "These are the narratives of bygone years regarding the origin of the land of Rus, who first began to rule in Kyiv, and from what source the land of Rus had its beginning." So you can see already here you're using Rus both as a people and a land, which we will continue to do. It is, of course, the question regarding the origin of the land of Rus which has become, and still probably is, the most controversial issue in the historical development of early Eastern Europe. Now, actually, the controversies around this question result from differing interpretations of several lines which occur already well into the text of the chronicle. More precisely, these are the entries for the years 859 and 862. As a chronicle, that's the way it's written. You have a date, and then allegedly what happened in that date. So those entries for 859 and 862 are important because this is the source of the controversy, and it might be worthwhile to quote those lines in their entirety from the chronicle. "There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war one against another. They said to themselves, 'Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law.' And then they accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus." We'll see these terms used over and over again, the Varangian Rus. These particular Varangians were known as Rus, just as some are called Swedes and others Normans, English, Gotlanders, for they were thus named. The Chuds, the Slovenians, the Krivichians, and the Veps, and these are all of these tribes, both East Slavic and and Finnic. So there they are, the Chuds, Slovenians, Kravicians, and Veps, then said to the people of Rus, our land is rich and great, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. Now, who were these Varangians that those Chuds, Slovenians, Kravicians, and Vepsians invited in the second half of the 9th century to rule over them? Well, the name Varangian is derived from the Slavic word varyagi, and that was the designation that was given by the local populace, as I mentioned up there in the north, to those Scandinavians who by the 9th century had been known throughout Europe for their attacks and pillaging. Now, I can imagine that everyone in this room does know about the Varangians, even though you've never heard of them perhaps before today, but you heard of other names for these same people. To the inhabitants of northern Germany, Britain, and Ireland, they were known as the Vikings. To the inhabitants of France, they were known as Norsemen or Normans. And so these Varangians, Vikings, and Norsemen were terms used in varying parts of Europe to describe groups of Scandinavians who swept down from the north in relentless attacks upon the cities and countryside of large portions of the continent and the British Isles, and we'll see beyond. I'm going to pass out these maps. Now, what was the situation in Europe during this 9th century, the 800s? Well, there are 4 factors that are worth keeping in mind. Here we are in the 800s, the 9th century. Close to the very beginning of that century, still ruled a man named Charlemagne, who had restored a modicum of stability to large parts of Europe, both north and south of the Alps. He and his successors were kind of recreators or continuators, they thought, of the Holy Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire. And so he created stability which had been unknown since Roman times. But Charlemagne died in 814. So almost at the very beginning of our 9th century. And among his successors, it was internal discord, dissension, and the breakup of his empire, leading to wars between various Christian kings and princes. Not soon or not long after Charlemagne died, beginning in 827, Muslim Arabs, our second factor, from the south, from the Mediterranean, began to attack southern Europe. They had already reached Spain and certainly in northern Africa, raiding first Sicily, southern Italy, then the Papal States in the heart of the Italianate boot, and southern France. That's our second factor. Our third factor was, toward the end of the century, a new nomadic people, the Magyars, started coming from the east, and the largest number of them arrived in the Danubian basin, modern-day Hungary. And from there, they carried out raids against Austria and Germany just to their west. And finally, the fourth factor, along the eastern extremities of the continent, between the Black and Caspian Sea, the Khazar Kaganate, about which we discussed. It was being subjected to attacks resulting from disturbances among nomads that until then had functioned on a friendly basis within the larger sphere of this Khazar influence. And as a result of these disturbances, that Pax Khazarica that we spoke about last time, the Khazar order, which flows close to 2 centuries, 650 to 850, had maintained relative peace and stability throughout the region north of the Black Sea, began to weaken. Trade was disrupted along the Volga, where they were based, the lower Volga, and the vassals of the Khazars, including Slavic tribes along the western fringes of their realm in Ukraine and to the north, began to grow restless. So here we have 4 factors that are going on in the 9th century. And considering these crises throughout several parts of 9th century Europe, it was easy for the Vikings, Varangians, to take advantage of the situation. Now, at first, they were content with hit-and-run raids on undefended coastal ports or towns and monasteries along rivers that they could come up with those famous boats that they had. And it was in this way that they attacked Scotland and England and Ireland and Germany and France, even passed through the Mediterranean to southern Spain, southern France, and Italy. Subsequently, however, having tested the waters, if you will, or tested the lands, coastal lands, they began to engage in more extensive campaigns, realizing the advantages to be accrued from less violent forms of behavior. They settled in various regions and took over the local administration, eventually being absorbed by the local population. Normandy in France, in the northwestern part of France, to whom they actually bequeathed their name. Naples and Sicily in the southern part of Italy, modern-day Italy, where the Norman kingdom of 2 Sicilies developed later in the 11th century, are 2 examples of their name being carried on. This thirst for adventure, for lands, made them go even farther west from the European continent. And as some of you know from, I guess, your courses in Canadian history, they moved to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, then to southern Greenland, and made it even here to Vineland in eastern Canada. Back in Europe, in the east, the Scandinavians, these Varangians, had a long, though broken tradition of contact stretching back to the first millennium BC. I mean, after all, the Baltic Sea, which at that time was known as the Varangian Sea, was quite close to the shores of modern-day Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So they did move back and forth, but never settled it for any period of time. But by the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, AD, the Scandinavians, who now came to be known as the Varangians, were back along the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea and Gulf of Finland, where they met Baltic and Finnish tribes like those Chuds and those Vespians that I just mentioned. And it was from them that the Varangian traders heard of the riches farther east, and particularly farther south, the riches of the Khazar Kaganate along the lower Volga and the lower Don. They couldn't help but be attracted by tales of the rich commerce that the Khazar Kaganate had carried out with the Arab Caliphate south of the Caucasus and the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire farther south. The products of the East, or as was known as the Orient, were still in demand in Western and Northern Europe, although the traditional route connecting Western Europe with the East was now interrupted in the Mediterranean by the invasions from the south of the Muslim Arabs, and wars as a result between Byzantium and the remnants of the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, during him and subsequent. And faced with these dangers in the Mediterranean region, merchants preferred to use overland routes across Central and Eastern Europe, north of the Black Sea, that passed through Khazar territory. The Varangians saw the advantage of this overland route, which might also reach Western Europe through the many waterways connecting the Caspian Sea down here where the Volga flows into, all of these waterways going up north. So you're going to still get to Europe, but not through the Mediterranean, around. Now, from the outset of the 9th century, the 800s, the Varangians maintained and controlled a regular trade route that went eastward up the Gulf of Finland, crossed these lakes here, down to the mouth of the Volga River, and then down the Volga River to where? To the capitals and centers of the Khazar Kaganate, whether in Itil, near the mouth of the Volga, and then the subsequent one, Sarkel, on the Don River. When stability in the northwestern areas of the Khazar Kaganate ended as a result of the arrival of these Magyars, who hadn't yet moved out of the area, this hampered trade along the Volga. So then the Varangians looked for alternative routes. And this led to their opening of a route directly south from this Lake Ladoga, which is just east of the Gulf of Finland, directly south through lakes, carrying their boats to the upper Dnieper River, and then coming down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea, along the edge of the Black Sea to Constantinople. This route, which the chronicler in our Rus primary chronicle called the Put Zvariag v Greki, that is the route from the foreign lands around the Baltic to Byzantium. Sometimes they call it from the Varangians to the Greeks. This route afforded the Varangian traders access via the Black Sea, not only to the Khazar Empire, because they could then get products from the Khazar Kaganate, but more important, to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. The extent of trade along this route was, of course, determined by the local Slavic tribes, such as one group called the Polyanians, around living in the region of Kiev, because all of these tribes were until then kind of vassals, part of the larger Khazar sphere. But difficulties arose in the 9th century when the Khazar Kaganate began to weaken. It couldn't fulfill its goal of protecting the East Slavic tribes, and as a result, those tribes began to lose the advantages that they formerly had within the protective shield of the Khazar Kaganate. They were forced to protect themselves against those nomads within the Khazar Kaganate, those restless nomads that the Khazars also couldn't control. And so these Slavs began to trade directly with Byzantium and to have, therefore, pretensions as to their own strength and independence vis-a-vis the Khazars. And they fought among themselves. These were the conditions of instability that reigned in mid-9th century Eastern Europe, and which led to that invitation to the Varangians that I cited at the beginning of this lecture. Now, it is not only the circumstances surrounding the invitation to the Varangians which has caused historiographical controversy, but also whether those Varangians were Scandinavians at all. And if so, what was the degree to which these Scandinavians had a determining impact on the organization of what we're going to see called Kyivan Rus, or just simply Rus as an entity, territorial. Now, there are two schools of thought regarding this question, and the partisans of each have come to be known as the Normanists, from one of the names of the Scandinavians, right? The Normanists. And then obviously you have Normanists, then we have anti-Normanists. Basically, what is the difference between these two schools of thought, if you will? The Normanists have argued that the Scandinavian Varangians played the dominant role in the creation of the Kyivan Rus state, of the Rus state. The anti-Normanists deny largely or completely there having been an important factor in the creation of the Rus state. And why this controversy? Well, it goes back to what we spoke about in our early lecture, the foundation myth. Right? I think you can maybe see where this is going. After all, this whole controversy began, literally, when patriotic scholars and writers in the Russian Empire in the late 18th century, during the Enlightenment, when we had the beginnings of national history, so to speak, and certainly in the 19th century, those historians were simply unwilling to accept the possibility that not only was Russia traditionally behind the rest of Europe in the 18th, 19th century, and even before, whether in general living standards, cultural life, but that this otherwise militarily strong Slavic nation state had even been incapable of organizing its original state. Horrors. Even in that, they needed outside help. The Scandinavians had to show them how to do it. Faced with such an unappealing historical scenario, any self-respecting Russian, or for that matter Slavic scholar, because it's not only Russians here involved, would quite naturally feel obliged to defend the glory and capability of the culture that he or she represented. In a sense, the subsequent Normanist, anti-Normanist debates are really an extension, albeit convoluted, of that deep-seated human concern with pride in one's own nation and ultimately in oneself. It is interesting to note that this primary chronicle, this Rus primary chronicle, does not begin with the invitation. That comes a little bit later. But rather with a description of the beginnings of Kyiv, which go back to the 6th century semi-legendary Polyanian leader named Kyi, who was a boatman who transferred people across the Dnieper River, together with his brothers Shchek and Khoryv and his sister Lybid. So these kind of figures are semi-mythological figures, figure prominently in illustrations and statues, etc., in terms of historical commemoration. But the chronicler's actual chronology picks up from the year 860-862. 860-862, as I mentioned with that quotation at the beginning. And that's because in that year, two men, one named Askold and the other Dir, Askold and Dir, received permission from the Varangian ruler in the north, up here in one of those places that the Varangians established called Novgorod, which means the new settlement, the new city. And his name was Riuryk. He's one of the three most important people who were invited. And so these Askold and Dir get permission from Riuryk to go to Constantinople, down in the south, ostensibly on a trading mission. But while they descend the Dnieper River, Askold and Dir stop at Kyiv. The local council, remember when we were talking about Slavs in general, they create these local councils which meet and have discussions about how to rule their land. So they met with this local council in Kyiv, and that local council, Ovicha, engaged them to take over leadership. Kind of another invitation at a local level. In order, why? To protect the land from the attacks of nomadic peoples, and who, those Magyars who still haven't left, they're still around. And others within that Khazar Kaganate. And in particular, they were concerned with a local East Slavic tribe. Always seems to be problematic in these early developments, an East Slavic tribe called the Varangians. We'll see that name come up. They were based just just northwest of Kyiv, more or less in the Pripyat marshes of the Pripyat River Valley, which of course you know where that is. And so this Askold and Dir accept the invitation. They establish order and control over the local countryside. And then, feeling self-satisfied about themselves, they sail down further the Dnieper River. They cross the Black Sea, and with 200 ships attack Constantinople in the year 860. This attack by Askold and Dir on the very capital of the East Roman or Byzantine Empire suddenly thrust this hitherto unknown Rus upon the minds of the civilized Eastern Mediterranean world. The Byzantines were stunned by the success of these new barbarians from the north. And in their well-established tradition of trying to reach some kind of modus vivendi, let's work out some kind of deal here. They were anxious to reach an accord. And of course, these Rus were still heathens. And so the first step was to send a Christian mission, which reached Kiev in 867. If we can't defeat them, let's convert them, I guess, literally. The mission, though limited, was considered successful because it made a few converts and did establish a church within Kiev's city walls. Now, at this point, it may be useful, perhaps necessary, to pause in our kind of historical chronology here in the 9th century in order to say something about the Byzantine Empire. I've mentioned it several times as a foil against which many of the events we have been discussing has taken place. We've already encountered the Byzantines in our discussion of those Greek city-states along the southern shores of the Crimea and the Bosporan Kingdom, farther east of Crimea and the Sea of Azov. And also we've mentioned Byzantium in the context of the Khazar Kaganate. But what was this Byzantine Empire? Well, stated in the most simple, straightforward terms, the Byzantine Empire was simply the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which after the fall of the city of Rome in 476, carried on the imperial heritage of the Empire of Rome. And in this regard, it should be also mentioned that the very term Byzantine didn't exist at the time. It's of later origin. It derives from the later Middle Ages. What's important to remember is that the citizens of this empire, as well as its rulers, considered themselves and designated themselves first and foremost as Romans, Romaioi. Even though they lived, all of them, along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, and they used Greek as their cultural language. Nonetheless, we are Romans. We are the descendants. We're part of this empire. Now, this Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire came into being how? Well, when the Roman Emperor Constantine I, he decided to transfer his capital from Rome to the east at the very beginning of the 4th century, the 300s. The site that was chosen was a small Greek settlement called Byzantion, located on the narrow straits of the Bosphorus, which connect the Black Sea with the Sea of Marmora and eventually the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. In modern-day terms, Byzantion, Constantinople, Istanbul. Same place. This was a meeting place of Europe and Asia. Beginning in 324, Roman builders transformed Byzantion into the magnificent imperial capital, which upon its completion in 330, they did a pretty quick job here. But of course, no one could build like the Romans. We still use some of their roads and aqueducts, etc., and bridges today. And when they completed it, they renamed it Constantinople in honor of the emperor who founded it. Constantine I was also the Roman emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the empire. So within a couple centuries from being a religion that was persecuted, now it's the official religion of the empire, thanks to Constantine. And so, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire was comprised of three basic elements. Three basic elements. One, Roman political tradition, with its heritage of written law and authority, centralized in a supreme ruler. Two, Hellenic culture, that is, carried on the tradition of classical Greece. And three, Christian belief. Roman political tradition, Hellenic Greek culture, Christian belief. These are the three basic characteristics of East Roman Byzantine Empire. Now, after the fall of the western half of the empire, including Rome itself, when it was overrun by various Germanic tribes in the 5th and 6th centuries, only Byzantium was left to carry on the political, cultural, and religious traditions of the great empire of the Roman Caesars. And in this respect, Byzantium became the second Rome. As the inheritor of the Roman imperial tradition, the Byzantine Empire stretched from the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea, through the Balkans, the Greek peninsula, Asia Minor, that is modern-day Turkey, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, the Middle East. Its greatest territorial extent was reached in the 6th century under an emperor called Justinian. Being such a large entity, the empire continually had to, through war and diplomacy, fight off its many enemies. In the east, first it was the Persian Empire, and then its successor, the Arab Caliphate. In the west were the Bulgars, the predecessors of the modern-day Bulgaria, which was just north of Constantinople, northwest. And there they created a powerful state in the lower Danube River. And then to the north were the various nomadic tribes of the Ukrainian and South Russian steppes, which continued to pour out of the east. And these included, as we know from our earlier list, Avars, the anti-Slavs, the Magyars, the Bulgars, the Khazars themselves, and finally, the Rus, all of whom the Byzantine East Romans disdained as little more than barbarians who wanted nothing more than to gain by spoil and plunder the riches of Greco-Roman civilization and life of the Byzantines who had that to offer. Now, the general Byzantine practice was to play off these barbarians from the north against each other, thereby hoping to maintain the empire's influence over the northern and eastern shores of the Black Sea, and to protect its ever-threatened frontier. Throughout its more than 1,000 years of existence, it came into being effectively in the 300s, and it lasted until 1452. And during those 1,000 years, Byzantium, Constantinople, remained a prize, a magnet toward which the peoples from the north were continually drawn. The Varangian Slavic Rus were just another of these peoples who were enthralled by the glitter of Byzantium. Now, as for Kyiv itself, in the late 9th century, changes were soon to occur. Although this Oskold and Dir, those leaders from the north in Novgorod, settled in Kyiv, they were not related to its ruler, Riuryk. And this Riuryk decided to extend the direct influence of his family southward. And so, on his deathbed, Riuryk established his youngest son, a man named Ingvar, to rule, but he was too young, so he gave him to his relative, until he got older, a man named Helgi, and he dispatched them to Kiev. Oleg confronted Askold and Dir, claimed they were not of princely stock, and killed them. Since Riuryk's direct offspring Ihor was not of age, as I said, Oleg then ruled in Kiev from 878 until his death in 912. Oleg, Helgi, must be considered the first Rus ruler, builder, state builder. In fact, in the words of the primary chronicle, it was this Helgi Oleg who declared that Kiev should be the mother of Rus cities, which in Western translation often comes out the mother of Russian cities, and one wonders, some propagandists, we know who, still use this term today. The mother of Russian cities is Kiev. Well, how can it be the mother of Russia cities when it's in Ukraine? Well, it's the mother of Rus cities, which is different. But that it should also become the center of a new commercial empire in control of a free water route from the Baltic to the Black Sea, which would connect Kiev with Novgorod in the north and with Constantinople and Byzantium in the south. Of course, that was an ambitious goal. And in order to achieve it, Oleg had to do a few things. He had to gain the hegemony over the still divided East Slavic tribes. He had to limit the power of the Khazar Kaganate to the southeast. He had to confront a new force that controlled the Ukrainian steppe, whether those were the Magyars, and then another group who came after them, the Pechenegs. So it's the nomads, always high on the agenda. And fourthly, he had to put pressure on the Byzantine Empire, whether through military attacks or trade negotiations, to obtain favorable relations, particular for trade. Now, we cannot go into any great detail regarding the political evolution of these, this first century, if you will, of Kyivan rule during what we can call the era of expansion. But I have put here at least the names of the first four rulers, including Oleg and his successors, each of which tried in one way or another to achieve those four goals that I had just outlined. And very briefly, as a for instance, Ingvar, when he came of age, continued the policies of Oleg in these four areas. Helga, who acted as a regent for her young son, is remembered because she was the first ruler Rus ruler to travel to Byzantium, to Constantinople, and she was the first Rus ruler to accept Christianity. Not for the whole group, but just for herself. And then Sveinald, her son, when he finally came to power, he subdued the Bulgars to the north, but the most dangerous thing is he attacked the capital of the Khazar Kaganate, basically weakening it and leading to more or less its end. You will note also that each of these rulers has a Scandinavian name and a Slavic name. We will talk about that when we discuss cultural matters. But to conclude now, the death of Sveinald, or Sviatoslav, in 972 marks the end of this first century of Kyivan Rus, which we can call the era of expansion. That is from the 860s until 972. Centered in Kiev, the Rus princes were able to bring together several East Slavic tribes, as well as a few neighboring Finnish ones in the north, carrying on the tradition of the Viking Varangian marauders who ravaged Europe throughout most of the 9th century. Kiev's rulers, most especially Oleg, Helgi, and Sveinald Sviatoslav, dreamed of an empire that would dominate the trade routes from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. So all of this area. In their rush, however, to expand their frontiers, they undermined their commercial rival in the east, the Khazar Kaganate, and by doing so, they upset the centuries-old stability in the area that had characterized the Pax Khazarica, and unwittingly removed the controls that had kept the steppe peoples in line and blocked new nomadic invasions. And so this, in a sense, qualified success of the Rus princes in the east was counterbalanced by the failure of the expansionist programs farther west, whether toward the Balkans or Byzantium in the south. In a sense, then, the Kievan realm had much more internal consolidation to undertake before it could hope to be a major and a long-lasting political force in this region. So we end this first era, the creation of the Rus state, the era of expansion, and when we return, we will discuss that second era, which we will be calling the era of consolidation. Thank you.